Now, while there has rightly been a new focus in this election on the cost of living, by which is meant, of course, the rising cost of everyday things that people can't go without, and that rising cost is generally described as inflation. So interest rates go up, designed to stop the flow of money, which then is meant to reduce the cost of goods and services because there is less demand. Mind you, you wouldn't know it, with both major leaders pretending to have answers to the cost of living, yet every day pouring money by way of promises into the economy. According to those keeping score, the coalition spending is up to $12.2 billion and Labor $6.8 billion. Little of it productive spending. Be that as it may, and looking down the track, my biggest concern amongst many in relation to cost of living, debt, dreadful education standards, my biggest concern is the unacknowledged mess we're getting ourselves into over climate change and the cost that this is likely to have on individuals and our economy and therefore our future. We have children marching in the streets, indoctrinated in the classroom, who couldn't answer 5 questions on so-called climate change. What is even worse, anyone who dares to dispute the tenets of this new religion is demonised and cancelled. The line is peddled that we must listen to the science. Well, what about Barack Obama's former chief scientist's book, Unsettled? I remember speaking to Professor Stephen Coonan last year when he told me he couldn't get a major media interview about his book, cancelled. The former chief scientist to Barack Obama, Professor Stephen Coonan, writes, leaders talk about existential threat, climate emergency, disaster, crisis, but in fact, when you actually read the literature, there is no support for that kind of hysteria. The science is insufficient to make useful projections about how the climate will change in coming decades, much less what effect human beings will have on it, unquote. He's a self-declared Democrat. He said he's increasingly dismayed by climate alarmism. Well, it's not only Professor Coonan. Dr. John R. Christie is a climatologist from Alabama. Quote, I've often heard that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that human beings are causing catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, he said, I'm one scientist and there are many who thinks that is not true. Dr. Charles Wax is the former president of the American Association of State Climatologists. Quote, first off, there isn't a consensus among scientists. Don't let anybody tell you there is, unquote. Stanley B. Goldenberg is a meteorologist at the UN National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Quote, it's a blatant lie put forth in the media that makes it seem there's only a fringe of scientists who don't buy into anthropogenic global warming, unquote. William Kinnenmoth was the former head of the National Climate Centre within the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. He said, quote, climate science is not settled. 4 decades of observations highlight that computer models have exaggerated the influence of anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide. He said, the Paris Agreement has been negotiated from faulty premises, unquote. The distinguished Richard Lindzen is the Professor of Meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He said, quote, what we will be leaving our grandchildren is not a planet damaged by industrial progress, but a record of unfathomable silliness, as well as a landscape degraded by rusting wind farms and decaying solar panels, unquote. And then there's Michael Schellenberger, the world-renowned environmental activist for 20 years. In his book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, he apologised in July 2020 for, quote, the climate scare we have created over the past 30 years, unquote. Of climate change, he said, quote, it's not even our most serious environmental problem, unquote. Schellenberger said, quote, once you realise how badly misinformed we've been, it's hard not to feel duped, unquote. So there's the word duped from the world-renowned environmental activist Michael Schellenberger. We are being duped. But the real worry is when the Prime Minister said last year, quote, we're moving towards net zero, this is a reality. The new energy economy is coming, you'll see it working through financial markets, unquote. Does this mean the Prime Minister supports outfits like the ANZ Bank saying it will stop lending to thermal coal miners? Or QBE's Zurich, Suncorp and IAG announcing plans to stop underwriting companies that derive revenue from fossil fuels? Will banks stop lending to a farmer to buy a tractor until he can articulate his climate change policy? Where are we heading? Well may Michael Schellenberger argue, quote, "One should realise how badly misinformed we've been. It is hard not to feel duped," unquote. This, to me, is our biggest crisis: alarmism and hysteria over climate change. We've got to educate ourselves and then educate our kids before it's too late.